The question hung in the air like poison gas, seeping into every corner of the Family Feud studio. Jessica Williams stood frozen at the podium, her hands instinctively moving to her flat stomach. The simple black dress she wore couldn't hide the emptiness that lived there now. "What's your biggest mistake?" Steve Harvey had asked. And those 4 words unlocked a door Jessica had been trying to keep sealed for 18 months. The studio lights felt too bright, too exposing. She could feel 300 pairs of eyes watching her, waiting for an answer that would entertain them. It was a Tuesday afternoon, taping at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta. The Williams family had driven 8 hours from rural Tennessee in Jessica's mother's old pickup truck. They needed this prize money desperately, but Jessica wasn't thinking about money anymore. The game had started normally enough. The Williams family was competing against the Chen family from California. Steve was in his element, cracking jokes, working the crowd with his signature blend of humor and warmth. But now, standing at that podium, Jessica felt like she was drowning in plain sight. Her mother, Linda Williams, stood at the end of the family podium, watching her daughter with worried eyes. Linda had been the one to sign them up for Family Feud, hoping it might help Jessica find some joy again. But seeing her daughter's face now, she wondered if this had been a terrible mistake. Jessica's hands trembled as she gripped the podium. The studio audience was getting restless, waiting for her answer. Steve's smile faltered slightly as he noticed something was wrong. "You okay there, sweetheart?" Steve asked, his voice gentler now. He'd been hosting long enough to recognize when someone was struggling. The cameras kept rolling, but the atmosphere had shifted from entertainment to something more fragile. Jessica looked up at Steve, her eyes filling with tears. In that moment, she saw not the famous game show host, but a man who might understand what it meant to carry unbearable guilt. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a whisper came out. "I can't." Jessica started, then stopped. The audience fell silent, sensing something profound was happening. Steve stepped closer to the podium, his full attention focused on this young woman who was clearly in pain. Behind the scenes, producers in the control room were unsure what to do. This wasn't typical game show territory, but Steve Harvey had learned long ago that some moments matter more than television. "Take your time," Steve said softly, setting down his cards. The gesture told everyone in the studio that the game was secondary now. Jessica wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of mascara across her cheek. What happened next would break every heart in that studio. Jessica's voice, when she finally found it, was barely audible but carried the weight of a grief that had been eating her alive. The microphone picked up every broken word. "I killed my baby," Jessica whispered, her hands moving protectively to her stomach. The studio went dead silent. Even the camera operators stopped adjusting their equipment, stunned by the raw honesty of her confession. Steve Harvey, a man who had made his career on quick wit and perfect timing, was speechless. Jessica continued, her voice growing stronger even as tears streamed down her face. The words came out in a rush, like a dam finally breaking. "I was using heroin when I was pregnant," she said, looking directly at Steve. "I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop. I told myself the baby would be okay, that I could quit after he was born." The camera captured every emotion crossing Steve's face. This wasn't just a contestant sharing a sad story anymore. This was a young woman confessing to something that had destroyed her soul. "He was born addicted," Jessica continued, her voice cracking. "Went through withdrawal for 3 weeks. The doctors said he was getting better, that he might make it." She paused, struggling to find the strength to continue. Steve Harvey did something he'd never done in 40 years of television. He walked away from his podium, around the game board, and stood directly in front of Jessica. The cameras followed him, but this was no longer about entertainment. "What happened to your baby?" Steve asked gently, though he already knew the answer from the pain in her eyes. Jessica looked up at him, and in that moment, she wasn't a game show contestant. She was just a broken mother who needed someone to listen. "He died," Jessica whispered. 3 months old. The doctors said his heart just stopped. All that suffering I put him through, and then he died anyway. Her legs gave out slightly, and Steve reached out to steady her. The studio audience was crying now. Some people had their hands over their mouths in shock. Others were openly sobbing, thinking of their own children. The Chen family, their competitors, abandoned their podium and moved closer, forming a circle of support around Jessica. Steve Harvey made a decision that would define not just this moment, but his entire legacy as a host. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief. Without saying a word, he gently wiped the tears from Jessica's face. "Jessica," Steve said, his own voice thick with emotion. "Look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, and what she saw there wasn't judgment or disgust. It was compassion from a man who understood that addiction was a disease, not a moral failing. "You didn't kill your baby," Steve said firmly. "Addiction killed your baby. There's a difference, and that difference matters." The words hit Jessica like a physical force, and she collapsed against the podium, sobbing. But Steve wasn't finished. He turned to address the entire studio, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. The cameras captured every word, broadcasting this moment of raw humanity to millions of viewers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve announced, "we're going to stop this game right here. This young woman needs something more important than points on a board." He looked directly into the main camera, speaking to America. "Jessica is fighting a battle that millions of people are fighting," Steve continued. "Addiction doesn't discriminate. It destroys families, takes children, breaks hearts." He turned back to Jessica, who was still gripping the podium for support. Steve did something unprecedented then. He removed his suit jacket, the same jacket he wore for every taping, and draped it gently around Jessica's shoulders. The gesture was more than symbolic. It was a transfer of strength from one human being to another. "This jacket has been with me through thousands of shows," Steve said. "It's seen families win and lose, laugh and cry. But today, it's going home with someone who understands what real loss looks like." Jessica pulled the jacket closer around herself, feeling its warmth. The camera operators continued filming, but everyone understood they were witnessing something that transcended television. Steve reached into his pocket again and pulled out his personal business card. He pressed it into Jessica's trembling hands. "This has my personal number," Steve said. "Not my manager's, not my assistant's, mine. When you're struggling, when the guilt is too heavy, when you need someone to remind you that you're worth saving, you call me." The promise carried the weight of absolute sincerity. Behind the scenes, something extraordinary was happening. The production crew, who had seen hundreds of tapings, were openly crying. Producers who usually worried about timing and ratings were reaching for tissues. Even the security guards had stopped their rounds to watch this moment of pure human connection. Jessica looked down at the business card, then back up at Steve. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger, like speaking her truth had begun to lift some of the weight she'd been carrying. The studio held its breath, waiting for her words. "I've been clean for 8 months, Jessica said. "But every day, I wake up hating myself for what I did to him." She touched her stomach again, a gesture that had become habit. "I named him David. He would have been 2 years old next month." Steve's eyes filled with tears. Here was a mother who had lost everything but was still fighting to stay clean, still honoring her child's memory. The audience could feel the sacred nature of this moment, the way Jessica was transforming her pain into purpose. "David is proud of you," Steve said simply. "Every day you stay clean is a day you honor his memory. Every step you take toward healing is a step he's taking with you." The words landed like a blessing, and Jessica's shoulders straightened slightly. What happened next stunned everyone in the studio. Jessica removed a small worn photograph from her purse, a picture of David taken during his brief life. She held it up for Steve to see, and the camera captured the image of a tiny baby with tubes and wires, fighting for life. "This is the only picture I have," Jessica said. "He was so small, so perfect. Even with all the machines, he was beautiful. She kissed the photograph gently, then looked back at Steve with something that might have been the beginning of hope. Steve took the photograph with reverence, studying David's tiny face. When he looked back at Jessica, his voice carried the weight of a promise that extended far beyond this moment. The entire studio waited for his words. "Jessica," Steve said, "David's story doesn't end with his death. It continues through you, through your recovery, through every person you might help by sharing your truth." He handed the photograph back to her with ceremony, like he was returning something sacred. The applause that followed wasn't typical television applause. It was the sound of 300 people recognizing something profound, something that reminded them of their own capacity for forgiveness and redemption. The sound filled the studio and seemed to lift Jessica slightly. As the cameras finally stopped rolling, Steve didn't return to his mark or prepare for the next segment. Instead, he stayed with Jessica, helping her off the stage, making sure she was surrounded by support. The Chen family, complete strangers minutes ago, exchanged contact information with the Williams family. In the months that followed, Jessica's episode became the most powerful in Family Feud history. Not because of the game, but because of the moment when entertainment became ministry. The show received thousands of letters from viewers sharing their own stories of addiction, loss, and recovery. Steve kept his promise to Jessica. They spoke regularly, and he connected her with resources for grief counseling and addiction support. 6 months later, Jessica celebrated 1 year of sobriety, and Steve sent her a new jacket, one that fit properly and carried its own promise of continued healing. Jessica's story didn't end that day in the studio. It transformed. She began speaking at addiction recovery centers, sharing David's photograph and her journey. Every person she helped stay clean became part of David's legacy, proof that even the deepest pain can become a source of healing for others. The jacket Steve gave her that day hangs in Jessica's apartment, next to David's photograph. She wears it to every speaking engagement, every meeting where she shares her story. It has become her armor against shame, her reminder that she is worthy of forgiveness, including her own. Steve Harvey learned something that day that changed how he approaches every show, every contestant, every moment he spends in front of those cameras. He learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop entertaining and start healing, because some stories are too important to be just television. Today, Jessica is 3 years clean and working as a counselor for pregnant women struggling with addiction. David's room in her apartment has become a memorial and a promise filled with thank you letters from mothers whose babies lived because Jessica helped them get clean. Each letter is proof that love finds a way to multiply, even in loss. The business card Steve gave her that day is framed next to David's photograph. It represents more than a phone number. It's a symbol of what happens when one person's pain meets another person's compassion. It's proof that sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we stop performing and start caring. Because David's 3 months of life mattered. Jessica's recovery matters. And the moment when a game show host looked past entertainment to see a mother's broken heart, that matters most of all. That's not just television. That's the moment when humanity breaks through, reminding us all that love and loss and redemption are the only stories that really matter.